Solomon Mensah was 42 years old, a commercial pilot who had spent 20 years putting other people down safely on runways they never worried about, and had never once rushed a checklist. He drove a sedan that was 8 years old and ran clean because he serviced it himself between rotations. He wore the same leather flight jacket he'd worn for 4 years, cracked soft at the elbows, because it still kept the cold out at altitude, and he saw no reason to replace what worked. That spring, while he was on a 3-day rotation, his wife transferred everything she could reach out of their shared accounts, booked a one-way ticket to Paris with the man she'd been seeing, and left him a text that said she deserved a real life, and he'd never given her one. What she didn't know was that her flight connected through the very hub Solomon was based at, and that her husband, in full uniform, would be standing past security when her gate changed. She had no idea how wrong she was about the man she thought she'd left behind. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The crew lot was still dark when Solomon pulled in. No sunrise yet, just the distant whine of an Apu spooling up and the cold coming off the tarmac. He filled his thermos in the car and screwed the lid tight. He had a dawn departure and a full day of legs ahead, and he liked to get to the aircraft early, before the rest of the crew, when the flight deck was just switches and checklists and the day hadn't asked anything of him yet. He ran the walk around the way he always did, looking for the one thing out of place, the panel not flush, the fitting weeping a drop it shouldn't. Because the one thing out of place was the one that brought an airplane down. He did not yet know that the same habit was about to carry him through the worst morning of his life without losing altitude. He only knew the work, and the work was honest, and that had always been enough. Solomon had spent 18 years building a reputation in a profession that runs entirely on whether you do the small things right when no one is watching. Captains requested him as their first officer. Czech airmen used his approaches as the example. He had moved up to captain on the wide-body fleet, the seat that flew the long oceanic legs, and he'd carried that same unhurried discipline home for 9 years. He was the kind of man who showed up. He had also, the year his grandfather passed, come into more than the family understood, a long-held portfolio his grandfather had built freight-load by freight-load over 50 years, left to the one grandchild who'd made something steady of himself. Solomon kept it in his own name, and accounts Renata never asked about, because she had decided early what a pilot was, a glorified bus driver. She'd said once at a party, laughing, a man gone half the month who came home smelling of jet fuel. He had let her have the joke. He had never needed her to know the size of what his grandfather left, because explaining it felt like bragging, and he'd never once flown a leg for an audience. He didn't know it then, but she'd been planning her exit for over a year. She was just waiting for a rotation long enough to do it clean. The morning it happened, he was at a layover hotel 2 time zones away when the banking alerts came through, one after another, the way they do when someone is moving fast. The shared checking, drained. The shared savings, drained. The household credit line, drawn to its limit. Then the text that she deserved a real life, that he'd never given her one, that by the time he read this she'd be gone and he shouldn't bother. There was a flight confirmation she'd accidentally left herself logged into on the shared travel account. A one-way to Paris, 2 passengers, departing the next morning, connecting through Solomon's own home hub. Solomon set the phone face down on the hotel desk. He didn't throw it. He didn't drop it. He set it down with the same deliberate care he gave a throttle on short final, like a man placing a control he intended to use again in a moment. He read the alerts twice, not because they shook him, but because he wanted to note exactly which accounts she'd been able to reach and which she hadn't. He noticed she'd taken everything in the shared accounts and not 1 cent more, because there was no more she could see. He noticed the second passenger's name on the confirmation, a man called Tien, a lifestyle consultant she'd met through a friend, who Solomon now understood had been the reason for a year of small absences. He filed it away. He didn't decide yet what it meant. Then he picked the phone back up, called crew scheduling, and confirmed he was deadheading home on the first flight in the same morning, into the same terminal. What Solomon had built, over 9 years of marriage, was not the life she said he'd failed to give her. He understood that now, sitting in a hotel room with both feet flat on the floor the way he sat through turbulence, what he'd built was a habit of carrying the household quietly, while she enjoyed it loudly. The mortgage he paid, the trips he booked on his passes, the version of himself he kept small so she'd never have to feel she'd married down. He thought, in that hotel room, about the years of small dismissals he'd filed away without comment. The dinner party where she'd called him a bus driver with wings, and the table had laughed, and he'd refilled her glass. The way she described his job to new acquaintances as he's gone a lot. It's not glamorous, trust me. Steering past it before anyone could ask what it was actually like to land a wide-body on a wet runway in a crosswind. The anniversary she'd spent complaining to her sister on the phone, within his hearing, that she'd thought she'd married someone who'd go further. He had absorbed each one the way he absorbed a rough leg, hands steady, nothing telegraphed to the cabin, because making a point of it would have embarrassed her among her people, and he'd decided long ago to carry that cost himself. He saw now what the carrying had taught her, that there was no floor to how small she could make him, because he would never make her pay for it. She'd built her whole sense of the marriage on that. She'd never once checked the reserve tank. 3 years earlier, when her event-styling business stalled, he had quietly moved $58,000 through the household account to keep her vendors paid, and she'd told her sister she'd turned it around herself. He had let her have that too. He had a long history of letting her have things, including the belief that he was the lesser half of the marriage. His Aunt Philippa had watched all of it. She was 70, small, with silver hair pinned close and reading glasses on a beaded chain. She had never said a word against Renata, because Philippa was the kind of woman who waited to be asked. She lived in the tidy house near the old airfield that Solomon had bought back for the family the year his grandfather died, and her kitchen smelled of coffee and cedar and something sweet always cooling on the counter. She was the one person in his world who knew what his grandfather had actually left him, and who'd never once mentioned it to anyone. She said his name like it had weight. That was what Renata had never understood. Until the spring everything turned, Philippa had been the only one counting on his side. He called her from the hotel that night. She listened to all of it without interrupting, the way she did. "You're flying home in the morning," she said. It wasn't a question. "Same airport. Same terminal," Solomon said. "Her connection comes through it. Then call Walter before you board," Philippa said. Walter was the attorney who'd handled his grandfather's estate and Solomon's own affairs for years. "Eat something first, then call him. You don't fix a thing this size tired and empty." She paused, and then she said the thing she'd been waiting to be asked to say. "I've kept a record, Solomon. I didn't want to be the one to tell you before you needed it, but I have it ready." She had a memory for faces and a notebook for things that didn't fit, and when he reached her house 2 days later, she set it on the table, black cover, spiral bound, and opened it to the first entry, dated the previous autumn. Renata and a man at a restaurant near the airfield on a weekend Solomon had been flying. Dates, the man's car. The lifestyle consultant she'd introduced once, too brightly, at a barbecue. Below one entry, in Philippa's precise hand, a note that Renata had asked her too casually whether pilots' pensions passed to the spouse automatically, testing the shape of a future she was already planning. Solomon read it the way he read a logbook, page by page, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say to a record that confirmed what the morning's bank alerts had already begun to spell. He called Walter at 7 from the gate, and what Walter laid out was not a trap. It was the plain shape of what she'd done and what the law made of it. The accounts she'd emptied were marital, and moving the funds didn't make them hers. A court would treat what she'd taken as exactly what it was, and the record of the transfers, time-stamped, one after another, on the morning she fled, would document it more clearly than any argument. More to the point, Walter said, the money she drained was the smaller part of the picture. The grandfather's portfolio was Solomon's separate property, inherited, held in his name, established, and walled off long before this marriage ever wobbled. The way Solomon walled off a reserve fuel load he had no intention of touching, unless the day went wrong. She had flown to Paris believing she'd taken his everything. She'd taken the contents of 2 checking accounts. "There's a thing you should let me check," Walter said. The travel account she stayed logged into. If she booked the Paris trip on it, what else did she book on it? What Walter and a forensic accountant named Tonde found over the following days was the layer underneath, the way there's always a layer underneath. Renata had not simply run with the household cash. Over the prior 6 months, she'd been quietly funneling money to Tien, $46,000 in transfers framed in her own notes as consulting fees, financing the man's perpetually launching lifestyle brand with money Solomon earned at altitude. The Paris flight was booked on the shared travel account. So were 3 earlier trips she'd told Solomon were girls' weekends. The man she was flying off to start a real life with had been living, for half a year, on the pilot's salary she'd been calling a bus driver's wage. Solomon spread it all on Philippa's table, the way he laid out an approach plate before a difficult arrival, not reading any single line, reading all of it together, briefing himself on where the terrain was. He could see the whole shape of it now. He didn't move fast. That was the part she would never account for. Renata had spent 9 years deciding what kind of man Solomon was, and she'd been wrong about the only thing that mattered. She had mistaken his calm for the absence of capability. It wasn't. Calm under load was the most practiced thing he had. 20 years of it. Every approach, every emergency drilled until his hands stayed level when everything else wasn't, and it was simply the one capacity she'd never had a reason to watch him use. If he'd wanted fast, he could have frozen what accounts he still controlled, and let her card decline at the Paris hotel, and stranded her there, petty and immediate. One phone call. Done, but stranding her was a scene, and scenes could be spun into the story she was already telling about the controlling husband. He wanted the truth to land in order, documented, where it couldn't be cried away. He let her fly. He let the trip happen. He understood sequencing. You don't begin the descent before you're cleared for it. "She thinks she's already gone," Solomon said. "She thinks I'm still 2 time zones behind her." Philippa said nothing. She refilled his coffee. On the deadhead home, he had 11 hours over dark country to decide what kind of man he was going to be about it, and he used them the way he used a long oceanic leg, methodically, without drama. The petty moves arranged themselves in front of him, and he set each one aside. He could call the bank and reverse what was reversible, and let her stand at a Paris counter with a declined card. He could call the airline he knew better than anyone and make her connection a misery. He could meet her at the gate loud, in front of Tien, and take back the dignity she'd spent the morning helping herself to. He looked at each option the way he looked at a shortcut on an approach. Tempting, faster, and exactly the kind of thing that turns a routine arrival into an incident report. He wanted no incident report. He wanted the record clean and the truth documented, and his own hands level the whole way down. So he let the accounts sit as evidence rather than freezing them as a weapon, and he told Walter to do everything strictly by the book, and he let her keep believing she was a continent ahead. He did go to the airport. Not to stop her. He'd worked that out on the flight home. Somewhere over the dark middle of the country. He went because his own deadhead landed there, because his crew base was there, and because Walter had arranged, entirely by the rules, for Renata to be served with the divorce filing and the financial disclosures at the first lawful opportunity, which happened to be in the terminal during her layover, by a licensed process server. With no drama and no scene, Solomon's only part was to be present, in uniform, having just flown in, so that when her connection's gate changed and the crowd shifted and she looked up, the first face she'd see past security was the husband she'd believed was a continent behind her, standing calm in his cracked leather jacket, not chasing her, simply there. He arrived at the gate area 40 minutes early. On any flight, the captain who boarded last was already behind. The terminal was bright and loud, the particular churn of a connecting hub at midday. Walter had come in person, with Tunde and the process server, and they waited near the departure board where her rebooked gate would post. The board flipped. Her Paris connection moved 3 gates down. The crowd turned, and there, coming up the concourse with Tien and a roller bag and the bright, unbothered face of a woman certain she'd won, was Renata. She saw him before she saw the others. She stopped. The roller bag kept rolling a half step and tapped her heel. Solomon did not move toward her. He stood where he was, hands loose at his sides, and let her cross the distance with her eyes the way she never had before, reading him, for the first time, as someone she might have misjudged. The process server stepped forward, said her name, confirmed it, and handed her the envelope, professional and brief. "You've been served," he said, and stepped back. Walter spoke then, quietly, factual, not cold. "Mrs. Mensah, the transfers you executed yesterday have been documented and reported as marital funds. They will be treated accordingly. The filing in your hands includes a financial disclosure. You should review it with counsel before you travel." He set, on the top of her envelope, a single summary page, the transfers to Tien's brand, the dates, the girls' weekends that hadn't been, the 46,000 laid out in her own framing. The silence around the 3 of them held 11 seconds inside all the noise of the terminal. Solomon counted them. Renata read the summary page. He watched her read it twice. Something moved across her face that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite recognition. It was the specific look of a person realizing the structure she'd built was standing on the wrong foundation, and had been the whole time. She had emptied 2 accounts and called it taking everything. The page in her hand said the man beside her had been living on the salary she'd mocked, that the trips had a paper trail, that the husband she'd flown to escape had simply taken the same flight home and been standing at the gate when the floor gave way. Her hand came up to her mouth. Tien had already taken a step back from her, his eyes on the board, calculating whether he was still flying to Paris and on whose money. Solomon did not stay to watch it settle. He had not come for that. He gathered nothing. He'd brought only himself and his flight bag, and his being there had served its purpose. He nodded once to Walter. He turned, and the uniform and the long, unhurried stride carried him up the concourse toward the crew room, the way he walked off every aircraft. He paused beside her once. He said it quietly, only for her, not as performance, because it was meant for her. "You flew across the world to get away from me," Solomon said, And the worst part for you is going to be realizing I was never the thing you needed to get away from." He walked off without looking back. It did not happen all at once. Tien's lifestyle brand, cut off from the money Renata had been quietly feeding it, never launched the version of itself he'd been promising, and the Paris life lasted about as long as the cash she'd carried did. The 46,000 and the drained accounts were accounted for in the final orders, returned to the marital estate, and divided as the law required, which left Renata with far less than the everything she'd thought she'd seized. The friends she'd told her, brave, deserving a real-life story, went quiet when the dates came out. She was not ruined in any loud way. She was simply smaller, carrying the particular weight of a person who'd flown to a beautiful city to start a life she'd been financing with someone else's discipline. Not dramatically, just constantly. Solomon did not talk about any of it. He kept flying. The approaches stayed stable, the checklists unrushed, the passengers in back never knowing the captain's name or that anything in his year had ever shifted. He answered every serious call on the ground the same day. He never touched his grandfather's portfolio. It sat where it had always sat, doing what his grandfather built it to do. And Solomon paid off the house with the restored funds and a little of his captain's salary, quietly, the way he did everything. 14 months later, on a cool evening in early October, Solomon sat on Philippa's back porch with a glass of water, while the neighborhood settled into night and, now and then, an aircraft drew its slow light across the sky above the old airfield. Philippa's voice came from the kitchen, asking if he wanted the last of the cobbler. His thermos sat on the rail, filled for the morning, the dent in its side catching the porch light. He thought about the dawn departure, the walk around, the one fitting that might be weeping a drop it shouldn't. He did not think about the terminal, or the text, or the look on her face when the gate changed. He thought about the work. He finished his water. He went inside and turned out the light. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.